Cherokee Rose sits on more than 100 acres of hills and woodland in Spalding County.
It's going to be single elimination until there's one man left standing. We've got eyes and ears, guns, ammo down there for you.
It's the home of a Sporting Clays club where shooters with their shotguns aim at clay discs flung into the air.
We had a clear winner who was Jim Bennett, and we had a tie for second for Philip Singleton and Mike Dugan, who tied.
Those contestants, they're also Republican candidates for Congress, and this range is the venue for the final debate with all of the candidates before the primary.
While every other Republican candidate is running from the life issue, not necessarily our group here, but on the national level, we run to it.
Believe it or not, I voted against bad budgets that were Republican budgets.
On today's episode, how a Republican primary in Georgia showcases the sway of former President Donald Trump in the modern GOP.
And later, we'll look at other congressional and state house races ahead of Tuesday's primary.
I think campaigning is very important. Kind of shows people that I'm a regular person. I'm trying to make a connection with you guys on that face-to-face level.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
So, Rahul, last week, the setting of our podcast was the Inman Park Parade here in Atlanta. But this week, you're going to take us almost an hour south to a very different setting. And before we get into this, just a warning, during the first half of this podcast, we're going to play some clips where you can hear the sound of gunfire.
That's right, Sam. We're going to head down I-75, past the Atlanta airport, past Atlanta Motor Speedway to Cherokee Rose in northern Spalding County. Now, the moment you get out of your car, you have to get used to the sound of shotguns going off every so often. You see, Cherokee Rose has multiple courses and areas to shoot sporting clays. My sons play golf, and it has a little bit of a feel of a golf course with a clubhouse. Cherokee Rose this past weekend was also the home of the final debate among the 5 Republican candidates for Georgia's 3rd Congressional District. It's an open seat because Republican Congressman Drew Ferguson is not running for re-election.
Okay, so you've got an incumbent not running for re-election. Clearly, this has attracted so many people who are clamoring for a seat in Congress. Tell me about these 5 candidates.
So, Sam, this race features 3 former state lawmakers, a former police officer, and a former Trump administration official who's still connected to the former president. So let's start with that person. That's Brian Jack. And what jumped out to me was almost every single answer during the forum. He connected back to the former president.
At the end of the day, under President Trump, working with him in the White House, we accomplished incredible things. We had a soaring and booming economy. We had a secure border, and we appointed and confirmed 230 conservative federal judges up and down the federal bench.
And Sam, you know, there were yard signs there for attendees to take home, and his simply said, Trump endorsed Brian Jack for Congress. Also, the flyers on the tables had a picture of him with former President Trump. And on the other side of that flyer was the endorsement quote. So very clearly, Brian Jack has built his campaign around the former president. Another one of the candidates is former State Senator Mike Dugan, who actually resigned from office earlier this year to run for the seat after Ferguson made his announcement. At one point, Dugan was Senate Majority Leader, and that was one of his selling points to the audience.
We got some stuff accomplished that y'all had been saying for years. I want y'all to do this. Like for years, y'all said, I want you to lower our income tax. The 4 years as Majority Leader, we lowered your income tax 3 times, including the largest income tax cut in state history, and sent $2 billion back. We got the heartbeat bill across the finish line. We got constitutional carry across the finish line.
So the heartbeat bill that he referenced there, that's the 6-week abortion ban that passed in 2019, but did not take effect until 2022 after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Now, in the show open, you heard the voices of 2 other former state lawmakers. Mike Crane has been gone from the state Senate a little longer. He actually ran for this seat in 2016. You also heard from former state representative Philip Singleton, and he very much sold himself as as a conservative who will even go against his own party from time to time. And then the final candidate, Jim Bennett, who, by the way, was the winner of the Spalding Clays shootout. He got one of the biggest applause lines when he talked about getting rid of the IRS and then talking about the fair tax. And that is a flat tax that is based on consumption and spending.
Okay, so Rahul, something that we have been tracking these last few election cycles is how relitigating the 2020 election result continues to be a through line in many of these Republican races, especially in primaries. And I wonder, how do we see that theme coming up in this particular race?
So, Sam, let me take you back a couple of weeks when these 5 candidates faced off at the Atlanta Press Club. Here's debate moderator Russ Spencer of Fox 5 asking this question.
The former president continues to insist that the last election was stolen. Let's put a fine point on this, a show of hands. Who here thinks that President Trump was the rightful winner of the election in Georgia in 2020? Okay, all of you.
All right, all 5 candidates there saying baselessly that the 2020 election was won by Donald Trump.
And Sam, that is the reality of running in a Republican primary in 2024. We should mention that while Congressman Ferguson did sign on to the state of Texas's failed lawsuit to invalidate 2020 presidential election results in states like Georgia, Ferguson later did not object to the House certification of the presidential results in Arizona and Pennsylvania. Back to this forum, it did come up indirectly during a lightning round where candidates were asked about replacing Dominion voting machines in Georgia. All 5 raised their hands. Those machines have been at the center of a number of election conspiracies.
All right, Rahul, tell me about the audience here. I mean, who shows up for this kind of debate on a Saturday? We know primaries are typically low turnout affairs. Clearly, these are people who are super involved.
So let's first tell the audience about the 3rd Congressional District, which was redrawn. It starts from the western and southern suburbs of Atlanta, including Douglas County, Coweta County, and Fayette County, runs over to the Alabama border, and then goes south towards Columbus. Now, 4 of the smaller county GOPs joined forces for this event: Pike, Lamar, Upson, and Spalding counties, along with a couple of other conservative groups. Again, as you mentioned, these are your kind of hardcore conservative and Republican voters. And there was actually an interesting moment early on. This is candidate Jim Bennett.
Show of hands. Who in here has already voted? Outstanding.
Sam, it was like 70 to 80% of the audience. They had already voted, but there were some folks still trying to decide who they wanted to vote for, like Jason Eggleston, who had come over from Fayette County. And 2 of the things at the top of his list: support of President Trump and opposition to current Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson.
Democrats have gotten everything that they wanted. I keep hearing the Pelosi finances on steroids. You know, the spending. Where we at? Almost $35 trillion in debt. We have no wins. We have nothing. And everything that we had a win on that got passed was was pushed back by the Senate, and then we just let it go. Didn't fight for anything.
Now, it's likely that this race goes to a runoff since Georgia has a 50% plus 1 rule. The runoff would be June 18th. Over on the Democratic ballot, there are 2 candidates, and one of them will face the winner of the Republican primary. But in all likelihood, this is a Republican seat, which will remain in Republican hands. The question is, who will be going to Washington?
Okay, Rahul, so maybe a few of our listeners live in this 3rd Congressional District, but for those who don't, I want to get into why we are spending so much time talking about this particular race. So let's zoom out. You know, all of these 3rd District candidates are vying for the Trump vote. It's not like there's any whiff of anti-Trump sentiment among these candidates, but that is not necessarily the case when we look at the broader Republican tent in the state of Georgia. You know, ahead of the party convention this weekend, Governor Kemp and other top Republican officials won't be there. Talk to me about the broader dynamics within the Republican Party in Georgia that you're watching this year.
You know, Sam, as I mentioned, Brian Jack is building his campaign around former President Trump. In the past few days, there's been a flyer that came out with Mike Dugan pictured next to Governor Kemp. He got a little criticism because Governor Kemp is not endorsed in that race. On the bigger scale, There is a Trump wing and a Kemp wing of Georgia Republicans. There are some that support both, some that are trying to work in both spaces. And the question really is, and why we're looking at all of this, is what happens this fall. It all dates back to 2020 when, Donald Trump accused Governor Kemp of basically disloyalty for not overturning Georgia's election results. And that really started the split. And when you're looking down the road for what Republicans will do, I parallel back to 2022. You ran into more voters who cast their ballots for Governor Kemp, a Republican, and Senator Raphael Warnock, a Democrat. Well, that option's not really here this time. The presidency is the only major race up the top of Georgia's November ballot. Again, going back to 2022, I talked to Republican voters who cast ballots for Governor Kemp and then skipped the U.S. Senate race instead of voting for Herschel Walker. So what's going to happen here? That's what we're trying to figure out here. Are Republicans going to stay home? Are they just going to skip the race for president? Almost every time we talk to Governor Kemp, he's talking about the Biden administration and the issues around the Biden administration and less about Donald Trump, the nominee. That's the reason we're having all these conversations, Sam, is what is that going to translate to in November?
Let's take a break here. You're listening to Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
So we've spent the last few minutes in Atlanta's western and southern far-out suburb talking about a heated GOP primary. We're going to stay with congressional races and travel to two majority black districts that wrap around Atlanta.
Let's begin in Georgia's 13th congressional district. This district begins in southern Gwinnett County, then runs down through Rockdale, grabs a little bit of Newton and a sliver of DeKalb before hugging the border between Clayton and Henry counties.
For years, the 13th district has been represented by Democrat David Scott. The 78-year-old has served the U.S. House for more than 2 decades, but this veteran member has attracted several primary challengers. Sam, why?
A key question running through this race: is Scott fit to serve? There are reports that Scott is in poor health, unable to do the job. He's not really campaigning and declined to participate in debates, but he has been a powerful member representing Georgia's interests in Washington, recently as chair and then ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee. And he did tell you in March, Rahul, that he's in good health and is doing the people's work. Our colleague Dormaya Vance talked to voters at the Rockdale County early voting location in Conyers. Here's Jacqueline Giddens, who voted for Scott, and Lakeisha Wallace, who wants an alternative.
He seems to be competent, so as long as he can do the job, I'm okay with his age.
You also have to understand when it's time to pass the baton to the next generation. Much like Moses and Joshua, the younger generation, you train them so that they can take the baton and continue.
I also want to point out that this congressional district looks really different than it did when voters last went to the polls in 2022. And that's because a federal court last year ruled that Georgia's congressional and state legislative maps violated the Voting Rights Act and ordered them to be redrawn with more majority black districts.
And that brings us to our next race that we're going to talk about, and that's the 6th congressional district.
Right. The new 6th district is now a majority black district, one of these new districts drawn under the court order. The court told lawmakers they could have drawn a majority black district in the suburbs west of Atlanta, but they didn't, and now they had to. In exchange, though, Republican lawmakers took the 7th congressional district, which is in the northeast suburbs of Metro Atlanta, and they made that one a lot more friendly to Republicans so that the partisan shift overall would be a wash. Democrat Lucy McBath decided to leave that 7th district to run in the new majority black 6th, and she is facing several opponents.
Now, we've been talking about races for Congress, but the state house maps were affected too, and that set up some interesting primary contests, mainly between Democrats.
Right. One I'm thinking of is Democrat Elena Parent, who was drawn into a new majority black district. Parent, who is white, is in line to be Senate Minority Leader and has racked up endorsements from top Democrats like Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock. Her challenger, though, is Nadine Thomas, a former state lawmaker who is black. And Thomas has baselessly accused Parent of suppressing black voters, even photoshopping a picture of her into a crowd of Trump supporters storming the Capitol on January 6th. Republicans also drew the maps to pit several incumbent Democrats against each other, again, to try and limit the losses that they would face from having to draw these new maps.
You know, Sam, one of the interesting races that I'm watching has nothing to do with redistricting, and that's between Democratic State Senator Sally Harrell and her challenger, David Lubin. Lubin's daughter was killed while serving in the IDF in the weeks after the Hamas October 7th attack in Israel. And he's challenging Harrell because she excused herself from voting on a bill that would have codified the definition of anti-Semitism, saying it could punish criticism of Israel. So this race has become a proxy for the debates within the Democratic Party over the conflict in Israel and Gaza and how to respond to it.
And, this weekend, President Joe Biden will deliver the commencement address at Morehouse College. And this speech will be closely watched as college campuses grapple with protests over the war in Gaza. And Biden struggles to shore up younger voters of color. Morehouse President David Thomas spoke with our NPR colleague Ayesha Roscoe.
If my choice is 20 people being arrested on national TV on the Morehouse campus, taken away in zip ties during our commencement, before we would reach that point, I would conclude the ceremony.
And Rahul, this week, ahead of his visit, Biden did an interview with Atlanta radio show host Big Tigger, who has a predominantly black audience.
I'm honored to be able to speak to the future leaders of America this weekend in Morehouse and celebrate the accomplishments of the graduates. But I have been very clear. Every American has a right to peacefully protest. Once that protest crosses the line into hate speech or violence, that's unacceptable. And so, your vote is your voice.
And if you needed any more proof that the spotlight will remain on Georgia, this week CNN announced that Biden and Trump have agreed to a debate on Thursday night, June 27th at CNN Studios here in Atlanta.
And before we go, Sam, I do want to remind folks on how to cast a ballot. The last day of early voting is today, Friday. And whether you vote today or you vote on Tuesday, you can request either a Democratic, a Republican, or nonpartisan ballot. The nonpartisan races will be on the partisan ballots.
And one PSA, at this point, election officials advise against returning your absentee ballot via mail. Instead, you want to vote early in person on Friday or deliver that ballot to a drop box by the end of this week. You can also hand deliver your ballot or go vote in person on Election Day. And Rahul, I checked in with election officials in several of the metro counties where we're hearing reports of mail delays because of this new Palmetto USPS distribution hub. Many of these metro counties say that large numbers of requested absentee ballots have not yet been returned at this point. In Fulton County, only 34% of requested absentee ballots have been returned as of Wednesday. And anecdotally, in Fulton County, some voters whose ballots were mailed on April 22nd are just now receiving their absentee ballots in the mail. Fulton County cited one example where a husband and wife both requested absentee ballots. They were mailed out on the same day from the county. The husband received his ballot and the wife still has not.
And if you do vote on Tuesday, the polls are open from 7 in the morning to 7 at night. You can visit wabe.org/election2024 to look at your sample ballot and to find your polling location, along with election results when we do get those posted.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. We'll be back next Friday.